Political experts have talked about how the election will come down to several key swing states and that it's possible we might not know who will win on the night of the election.
The American election is in 1 week, but establishment press and pundits alike are warning us that we might not know the results of the election next week for days and potentially even weeks to come. This is becoming the norm in Canada and the US. We used to know the results of an election on that night, but for some reason now it takes days due to mail in ballots. We're going to have to be following that next week very closely to see what happens. But already, even in the days and weeks leading up to the election, there's been a number of nefarious activities, voter fraud in some cases, and potential ability for people to try and cheat. We're going to be diving into all that today. I'm Rachel Parker, and you're watching Rachel and the Republic. Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to Rachel and the Republic. We are 1 week out from Election Day in the United States, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about what election night is going to look like, and then I wanted to dive into the presentation that I all promised you. As I mentioned last week, I did this presentation initially first. I did it live on Saturday at True North Nation down in Calgary, but I've repackaged it for the show so I can give you guys all the juice of some of the nefarious activities that we've seen leading up into the election. But let's start by taking a look at Election Day itself. So typically it was the norm. We all expected that on election night, everyone would go home with their family. You'd flip on the TV. Okay, maybe not everyone. This was definitely how it worked in my household though on election nights. You'd flip on the TV, you'd pull out some snacks, and you'd flip between the channels as results rolled in throughout the evening. Typically, sometimes I'd have to go to bed before the final results were announced, but it was still something that you could expect by the early hours of the following morning, you would know the results of the election. That is no longer the case. It is no longer the case in the American presidential election. It's no longer the case in Canada. For example, the BC election, which I covered yesterday, and the week before that on the Rachel Parker Show, it took a week to know the results of that election due to the mail-in ballots, which just kept showing up after the election day and kept being counted. And so it's typically caused a lot of distrust in our systems because polling showing one thing, results are leaning one way, and then all of a sudden all these mail-in ballots come in and they flip, as they did in BC. In some cases, they flip ridings, or in the States, they flipped key swing states. So it causes a lot of distrust in the system. And already the American establishment press is laying the groundwork to tell Americans that they should just expect that they won't have the results on election night once again. This here is from Reuters. Reuters writes, the U.S. presidential election will take place on November 5, but the winner of the razor-thin race between Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump may not be known for days after the polls close. As ballots are counted, one candidate may appear to be leading based on early returns, only for a rival to close the gap as more votes are tallied. In 2020, some states experienced a red mirage, in which Trump was leading on election night before a blue shift saw Democrat Joe Biden overtake him, a phenomenon Trump used to amplify his false claims that the election was stolen. Nothing untoward had occurred. Democrats tend to live in more populous urban areas where counting votes takes longer. Democrats have also embraced mail voting more readily than Republicans after Trump's false claims that mail ballots are untrustworthy, and those ballots take longer to count than election day votes. Trump has both encouraged and criticized early and mail-in voting in 2024. So when we talk about election results being delayed, a big part of the reason why they're delayed is because of the mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots can be sent, but they are not actually counted until election day, and that frequently causes delays in various ridings. Additionally, there's been cases where the mail-in ballots were received after the deadline in the states and were still counted, which goes against protocol for mail-in ballots. States designate the laws for mail-in ballots on a state-by-state basis. But that was something that we saw push through during the COVID-19 pandemic, that we saw a push for mail-in ballot because they didn't want people going out. And so they pushed through these laws, which basically changed how voting in the United States had happened for all of American history. And then, as the article said, it looked like Trump was leading in several king states. People went to bed thinking it was going to be a Trump presidency, and they woke up the next morning to find out that all of these shifts had happened. And it caused a lot of unease within American people. Just as in BC, it's causing unease with some people. The mail-in ballots were counted, and early polling had showed that the mail-in ballots were trending in favor of the Conservatives, and it ended up that they all basically went to the NDP. And so that causes a lot of distrust. If you want to learn more about the specifics of the BC election, head on over to yesterday's episode of the Rachel Parker Show to break that down for. But just so you guys know, next week I will obviously be covering the US election, and it seems at this point it's very unlikely we will know the results of the US election because everyone is basically telling us you can expect that you won't have results on election night once again due to the mail-in system. I don't know why the mail-in system is needed. I understand the pretenses that they pushed it for during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think a lot of times when we push to have voting be more accessible, it actually results in more distrust in our democracy. People can show up to the polls on voting day and vote. They don't need to send advance votes. Absentee ballots are obviously different. That's when you're out of the country and you're able to vote that way. But the level of mail-in ballots that we're seeing is unprecedented because the whole idea of mail-in votes are relatively new, and they cause these major delays on election night. And I think there's a lot of distrust in our systems because of the mail-in ballot systems. I think this is a case where, we've tried something new, similar to how we've tried to use the tabulators in Alberta on election night. You were able to vote outside of your riding. You basically put your ballot into a tabulator. It tallied that on election day. If you guys remember the last election in Alberta, the votes were very delayed because of the tabulators, because the tabulators did not tally those vote anywhere votes until election day, and then they had to be manually entered to a computer. And that wasn't connected to the internet for safety reasons so that it couldn't be hacked. And it actually ended up causing a major delay in Alberta. Now, we didn't have a situation in BC where it took days, but it did take hours. And so I think this is a circumstance where we've been trying new things to speed up the process of election day and to make it more accessible. And what we've instead done is we've eroded trust in our democracy, and we've actually slowed down the process. So I think when it comes to showing up in person, showing your ID, voting in person on paper on day, we already had it figured out. Maybe it was as perfect as it was ever going to be, and all these new things that we've done have not been progress, but they have actually caused us a backslide in how effective our elections are. So this is an example where technology isn't necessarily the solution. So for next week, we probably won't have those results on Tuesday night. We probably won't even have them Wednesday. I have a feeling it's going to be quite delayed again. But let's take a look at some of the activities, the nefarious activities that have been happening in the lead up to the US election, starting with Pennsylvania. So you guys all remember of course, the failed assassination attempt of Donald Trump in Pennsylvania that I reported on because I was there. A few weeks after that happened, Donald Trump went back to Pennsylvania and he hosted another rally there. And I have sort of pegged this as the moment that the momentum changed in the US election. On the show, I've said I felt like this was when we really saw the momentum swing for the Republicans. When Donald Trump went back to Pennsylvania, voter officials said that on the evening that he would be there hosting his rally in Butler with Elon Musk, that citizens in the state of Pennsylvania would not be able to register to vote that evening because the site would be shut down due to maintenance that had been scheduled in advance. So just conveniently, the one night that Donald Trump is returning to Pennsylvania after a failed assassination attempt, the voter registration is just going to happen to be shut down that very same evening. Now, of course, there was widespread outrage over this alleged scheduled maintenance, and officials agreed to turn, their voter registration back on for a little bit. But so often when we talk about the election being stolen in the United States, a lot of people will point at Donald Trump and they'll be like, he lied about a stolen election. And as you just saw in the Reuters article, they said, oh no, these mail-in ballots just all happened to swing key states in favor of Democrat Joe Biden. But in addition to all the issues that people have over mail-in ballots, a lot of people not trusting those processes, the mail-in ballots are more difficult to verify, those types of things. There's also been a number of nefarious activities in the lead up to the election that would cause distrust in the process. Things like this. This is an example of officials cheating for the Democrats by purposely planning this scheduled maintenance on a night that Trump would be in Butler. The reason that politicians hold rallies leading up to an election is to get people excited, to encourage them to go to vote, to encourage them to bring their friends out to vote, and to register them to vote. At these political rallies, if you go there, there's information all over the place about how to register to vote. And so by shutting down the ability for Pennsylvania residents to be able to register on the night of the Butler, Pennsylvania rally, they are essentially favoring the Democrats because they know that that was a huge moment of momentum. It was a huge show of courage and strength from Donald Trump to go back to the place where he survived an assassination attempt and to really rally up his supporters. And you know, a lot of people were at that specific event that might not typically have come to a Trump rally because Elon Musk was also there. One of the most famous entrepreneurs in the world was also there. So it would have just tended to bring more people to the event who were excited about seeing both Elon Musk and Trump after Elon Musk gave his endorsement, a very strong endorsement for Trump that night. It would have been likely that people who maybe haven't voted Republican in the past, maybe who weren't sure whether they actually wanted to vote for Trump, would have been inclined to vote for him and have sought to register to vote that night. And so biased voter officials in the state of Pennsylvania tried to make that impossible to do so. And there's other examples of this. Another in Pennsylvania, which is of course a key swing state in Lancaster, officials are investigating after they found 25,000 voter registration that appeared to be fraudulent. Election officials said up to 60% of them appeared to be fake. This is happening all across the states. We're seeing people try to cheat. So the question I have for you is, as I report on these examples where we found incidents where people were trying to cheat, how likely is it that not all of these examples have been found? Moving into Michigan. In Michigan, there's simply too many voters on the registration rolls. There's 8.4 million people registered to vote on the voter rolls in the state of Michigan. However, there's fewer than 8 million voting age residents in the state. So what happened there? What happened there is there's people who have moved out of the state. There's people who have passed on that have simply not been removed from the voter registration rolls. Now, people have complained, and the state has acknowledged that it needs to clear over 606,000 residents from the voter rolls, but they aren't expected to get around to that until 2027. When we think about the function of the state, I would argue that the state has limited functions that it continues to surpass. But one of the functions I would agree the role of the state is that of a free and fair election. And it seems that Michigan, for example, along with a host of other states, is less interested in ensuring that it has a free and fair election. But I can guarantee you that they are absolutely focused on making sure they glean every last cent from their residents' pockets. They're absolutely focused on creating new laws to make the residents' life more difficult, less free, more taxes. If you, for example, run a red light and there's a red light camera, they will go after you with everything they have to make sure they get that fine from you. And basically any reason, those types of fines are extremely high. They're a couple $100s. If you don't pay it at the first sign of payment, it continues to go up. And yet, when we look at the basic functions of state and government, they're not actually fulfilling the basic things, the things that most people, I mean, I'm sure there are some anarchists or some libertarians who would disagree that the function of the state is to run elections, but most people would generally feel comfortable with that statement, that the government should oversee elections. And yet that's just increasingly not a priority of states. It's increasingly not a priority of states to make sure that people trust in their voting system, that their voter registration rolls are up to date, that people who no longer live in the state are not on the voter registration rolls. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that something that is such a key foundation, such a cornerstone of democracy, is no longer being prioritized by our governments who are so busy with taxing us to death, essentially? So that's not the only example. Another incident that went viral in the last few days actually happened in Montana. An individual who had been employed by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee was seen at a voter box. You do see him go and touch the voter box. Now, this has been the matter of speculation. Was this individual trying to tamper with the voter box? Was he simply ensuring that it was appropriately attached? I'm going to play the video for you guys, and you can make that decision for yourself. So in that clip, you see this individual go up and he touches the voter box. Now, the senatorial campaign that he worked for said that he's been fired out of an abundance of caution, but that he basically was just checking to ensure that the box was appropriately attached. Listen, if you work in partisan politics, I think you need to be extra careful about your actions, especially when it comes to something like a ballot box where people are going to cast their ballots. You see him there, he touches the box with both hands. Maybe he's pushing it, maybe he's pulling it, maybe he's seeing if it's just simply attached, and then he sends a couple messages out and is going back and forth. That would have been a case where he should have asked election officials to go and check if he was concerned about the ballot box. He could have always gone with them. But the fact that he went and he did this on his own without giving anyone advanced knowledge as to what he was working on does arouse a lot of suspicion as to why he went there, what he was doing, who he was texting, and what this was all about. So he's been now fired out of an abundance of caution, even though the senatorial campaign committee says that, he was really just checking to make sure the ballot box was safe. Another example you might have seen going viral over the weekend was that 2 ballot boxes were actually set on fire in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. Hundreds of ballots were burned. You can see the video imagery of it. It's actually shocking that these ballot boxes were set on fire. Now, there tends to be one main school of thought coming out of the conservative campaign is that these types of actions actually exist to discourage people from going out to vote. Typically, when you don't see high voter turnout on election day, it's very good for the incumbent because it means that there's not a large amount of people who are desiring change. If not a lot of people go out to vote, maybe they're not excited about either of the candidates, but they're also not motivated to see change. So not a lot of not high voter turnout is a typically good thing for the incumbent. In that case, that would be the Biden-Harris administration. And so these types of things, when you see ballot boxes burning, obviously it's very illegal. Obviously it's something to be super concerned about. At the same time, people do these things to discourage people from going out to vote, especially people who are seeking change. So in that case, it would be especially those who would be more inclined to cast a ballot for Donald Trump and the Republicans on election day because they're tired of the status quo in the United States. They're tired of the high inflation. They're tired of living under this threat of World War III. And certainly in the United States, there's a sentiment of people feeling very concerned that they're going to get dragged into a war, into conflict in the Middle East under Joe Biden, compared to the peace that we did see under Donald Trump. So just take that with a grain of salt as well. Yes, ballot boxes were burned in 2 states. Hundreds of ballots were burned. But what is the actual message that's being sent there? People are being attempted to discourage to vote. Just the last example that I wanted to cover here of nefarious activities when it comes to voting leading up to Election Day is this footage. This is from the Heritage Foundation. Michael Knowles had it on his show. We'll play it for you in just a second. And it essentially reveals that non-citizens are planning to vote in Phoenix, Arizona. What is one thing that the left always tells us? They tells us, oh, people who aren't American citizens aren't voting, so we don't need to worry about people showing the ID on Election Day. It's not a concern. No one who's not a citizen isn't going to vote. Well, this footage actually counters that narrative. Take a look at this.
Hey, ma'am, how are you? We're an organization. Right now we're helping the Hispanic community here in the Phoenix area by giving information to people who might want to register to vote in the upcoming elections. Out of curiosity, are you registered to vote? Yes, we're already registered. Okay. You register here at work? Are you a citizen? No. Okay. Have you been registered yet? There's an application. It's in the place of assistance where they help us Hispanics when we come here. I marked yes so I could vote, but mark yes. Yes, I marked yes like I told you. Question came up asking if I wanted to vote. I said yes. Are you a citizen? No, I'm waiting for my residency right now. You're waiting for residency? Yes, okay. And you plan to vote this year? Yes. Last question is, who do you prefer right now? Trump or Kamala? Kamala. Kamala? Where were you born? In Cuba.
So the clip goes on there, and Michael Knowles says, oh, it's too bad because typically Cubans are more conservatives, and I would have expected him to essentially vote for Trump, is essentially what he says. I just thought it was funny. I really enjoy Michael Knowles as a podcast host. So there you have it. Non-citizens are planning to vote in Phoenix. When we look at all these examples, I think it creates an element of concern for all of us. There's already been so many instances of attempted cheating, of attempted voter fraud. In some cases, non-citizens are outright admitting that they're not voting. And as I've said, these are all the examples that, well, these aren't even all the examples we can find. If you were to go search on Google, you'd be shocked by all the examples of potential voter fraud that have been caught in the days and weeks leading up to the US election. But like I said before, I have to ask myself, what are the examples that we're not catching? As well, the one question I think that we all need to just think about, and if you guys have some thoughts on this, please put your thoughts in the comment section below, because I love reading your thoughts on these circumstances. Is it would be very easy for the powers that be to change things, to go back to what voting used to look like when you showed up in person on voting day and you cast a ballot that was a paper ballot that was later in the day counted by hand and was reported that night. It would be very easy to go back to the days of simple and traditional voting. And yet, instead of that, when people raise concerns about the process, when they raise concerns about cheating or non-residents voting, non-citizens, I should say, voting, when they raise concerns about voter fraud, mail-in ballots, they are instead told that they are election deniers and that they are the ones who we are told that we are the ones who are creating distrust in our democracy. Not all of these other examples that I've just pointed to. That's not an issue. It's us for talking about it and for pointing out and for voicing our distrust. The fact that people are out there and they're willing to voice their distrust in the system and their concerns over the processes, whether that be here in Canada or in the States, is a good thing for democracy, because we have the ability to say, I have concerns about the way that the election in BC was carried out. For example, in the election in BC officials were actually allowed to take home boxes full of ballots and just keep them in their house for a week while the recounts were done. I'm not okay with that. I don't think that that is appropriate. They should have been kept somewhere in a safe, not in an individual's home. And so it is a good thing for us to continue to have these conversations and to say we're not happy with how these processes are going and we would like to see change. Now, that is a sign, I would say, of a healthy democracy. Obviously, I'm concerned about the way our elections are being run. I think that our government needs to focus less on tampons in the bathroom for men and focus more on our elections and get back to a place where we can all trust the system once again. Because I don't know anyone who's saying, oh, I don't trust elections when they were cast by hand and on paper and counted by hand. Who's saying that they don't trust those elections? No one is saying they don't trust those elections. So why can't we get back to a place in our country once again where everyone feels confident in their system? Instead, now it can take hours, days, or weeks to know the results of an election. And I think we all need to continue to raise the alarm. As I said on Saturday to all of you, we need to continue to talk about this. We need to continue to be vocal about it and to demand change so that we have trust in our systems once again. Obviously, this is in the context of what we can expect next week, but we are beginning to see those problems filter down into Canada, as we saw in BC. And as I mentioned before, slightly in Alberta with the tabulators that we're seeing here. I think a lot of you guys are really uncomfortable with the electronics being used on election day. All right, everyone, let me know what you think. Why is the left so hesitant to make changes so that we can all trust our election once again? And do you have confidence in the system in the States? Are you confident that we will know the results of the election on election night, or that you will be able to trust those results? That's all I have time for today. I look forward to reading your comments. I hope that you guys have a great week. God bless.